what is my life about? Why is there life at all? How is it done? What's going on here? Why am I here?
Where do we come from?
Look at quantum physics.
An immense quantum mechanical iceberg of possibility.
Quantum mechanics allows supreme mind.
The brain is capable of millions of neural nets.
Biochemical
An emotional response. The brain does not know the difference between what it sees in its environment and what it remembers.
We are running the holodeck.
Whatever way we observe the world around us,
The rabbit hole and how deep and how far we want to go is really how much do you want to discover about your true nature?
Anybody who spends too much time trying to explain it is likely to get lost forever down the rabbit hole of mysteriousness.
What becomes real? Is it our body? Is it our cumulative genetics? Is it how we look? Is it how we walk? Is it how much we weigh or don't weigh?
What we're going to do with that knowledge and how we're going to speculate and examine possibilities and potentials to ask the big questions. What if? What would it be like? How would it be? The moment we ask those questions, it forces the brain to begin to fire in new sequences and new patterns. It breaks the routine.
I was basically trying to find the answers to what I've often called those four great questions that everybody faces, whether they realize it or not, even the agnostics and the atheists, as well as the believers and the pious. And that is, who are we? Where do we come from? What should we do? And where are we going? And if you don't answer those four great questions, obviously your life is pretty meaningless. And many people just stuff those questions down, and they want the answers made for them, or they want somebody like Jesus or Krishna or Buddha or somebody else to do it for them. It can't be done. It's like wanting someone to be born for you, or to die for you, or to eat your lunch for you. These things are inescapably personal.
What is truth? What is lasting truth? What is really important to you?
Questions about whether the world really looks anything like we take it to look, or whether this is just something that's radically altered by being filtered through our perspective, so on and so forth. These are questions which I take it everybody has a natural curiosity about. These are questions, these are the sorts of questions that, thinking about them is what makes life interesting.
Physics of mind, physics of thought. What is a thought? What's it made of? Is it made of anything? Does it have its own independent reality?
So these are the kind of things that we have to ask about. These are some of the questions that quantum physicists and so forth are looking at, and some of the questions that researchers of consciousness studies are looking at to try to uncover and unravel what is human consciousness and how we make sense of it.
Why are we here? Well, that is the ultimate question, isn't it? By we, I assume you mean consciousness, conscious beings. That's we. So why is consciousness here?
Do we really think we've used the mass of our brain power? You think we've really reached the depth of our intelligence? That would be an insult to us. We're really great beings.
Where do we end? Where do we end and the rest of the world begin? How come we feel separate when we aren't separate? And of course, one of the big questions is, if everything is mutable and reality isn't set, well, how come it feels solid?
The question really is, what is God doing to make a universe?
Oh, God. When we ask the great questions, something amazing happens in our mind. We have to stop the routine way in which we think. We have to stop allowing the environment to turn on the circuits in our brain that cause us to think the repetitive patterns that we are so in the habit of thinking on a daily basis. To ask the great questions is to be an inspiration. It's to stop the moving locomotive of our life.
Are all realities existing simultaneously? Is there a possibility that all potentials exist side by side? Have you ever seen yourself through the eyes of someone else that you have become? And looked at yourself through the eyes of the ultimate observer?
So the film asks, how far down the rabbit hole do you want to go? Remember that Alice went down the rabbit hole following, where she met the Mad Hatter. The Hatter was mad. Hatters became mad from mercury poisoning. And the idea was you want to get out of the rabbit hole after you've gone in. So there's two stages to science. There's the crazy part where you go down the rabbit hole, and then there's the part where you check the craziness of your ideas against a rigorous, strict, straitjacket-like process.
I think the interesting thing about science, the interesting thing about physics, is that it is a genuinely new and novel way of trying to come to grips with the world. I think the experimental method, which is important to physics, is a very different business from the method of revelation or the method of meditation or something like that. I don't think it's true that, for example, adherents of, say, Buddhism could imagine changing their beliefs based on the outcomes of some experiments people do with electrons.
Why this apparent rift between the church and science, or between science and religion, emerged today, I think the roots of that are very deep.
Is Newsreel Films presents exciting news! Is the divorce over? Are spirit and science tying the knot once more? Are the church and the laboratory saying the same thing? Out of the misty ages of antiquity, the quest for the divine and the quest for knowledge about the universe marched hand in hand. Ancient Sumer, there was a god of astronomy, a god of horticulture, a god of irrigation, and the temple priests were the scribes and technologists investigating these fields of knowledge. Ancient Greece, philosophers asking the questions of why are we here, developed the theory of the atom, celestial movements, and human ethics. Medieval Europe, the Western Church arose to a position of supreme power. Kingmaker, landowner, and purveyor of the truth. The church took it upon themselves to be the one knower of everything. The dogma was law.
Because it probably goes back to a conviction that some of the books of the scriptures, like the book of Genesis, which deals with the beginnings, is actually telling us about the origins of the world. Now, in fact, any biblical scholar will tell you, and this is not news, that the book of Genesis was never meant to be about the origins of the world. But many churchmen believed that in the book of Genesis you had actual sort of live news, like CNN, about the beginnings of creation. And therefore you had many people down through the ages, like the famous Archbishop James Ussher in Ireland in 1650, who calculated all the ages of the patriarchs back along and worked out to his own satisfaction that the creation of the world occurred in the year 4004 BC on the 17th of September at 9 o'clock in the morning.
Yet science had moved forward and now challenged the dogma that the Earth was the center of the universe. Copernicus, Bruno, and Galileo all felt the heavy hand of the Church. The tragedy. Unable to suppress science anymore, the Church and science divided up knowledge and human endeavor. Descartes invented dualism. The Church had the unseen, science the seen, and materialism was born.
Descartes invented dualism to avoid the problem between the Church and science.
A long time ago, we made the decision to separate sort of spirit from science. And that science, and we were in this low gauge symmetry state. Because there, the effects of most humans, of their consciousness, is very small. And so we were able to learn how to do science. But now we've learned, and now we can take on the richer task of learning to do science when consciousness, a significant amount of consciousness, is part of the experiment.
An uneasy truce. Scientists were no longer being bound, and they reacted with a vengeance. All the unseen is fantasy, delusion. We are strictly little machines running in a predictable machine universe governed by strict immutable laws. The Church pushed back. Soulless scientists were condemned to hell.
Back in the 17th century, we came out of a period of time where we saw the universe as this living, vibrant entity to that of the world as a machine. And with that, scientists came along, such as Descartes and Newton, which solidified that concept because they were describing science and mathematics of a non-living world, of inanimate objects, and did some very beautiful calculations and enhanced our understanding of non-living systems. Descartes really looked at the world as a machine. He was very interested in clocks. The problem is they applied this model of a clock or a wind-up toy soldier to living systems as if we understood the parts, the different components of the system well enough, we would understand how the system works, as in a clock.
The key underlying assumptions that most scientists still work under is that we live in a clockwork universe. We live in a mechanistic universe that is conceived of as gears and knobs sort of linking together. That is going to change because we know that that is not true. We know from a physics point of view it's not true. The impact of that change is still somewhat difficult to guess, but one of the areas that I know it's going to make a big impact is in how we understand the nature of human experience. Because human experience in a clockwork world doesn't fit. And that's why in mainstream psychology for many years, the very idea of an internal experience was considered to be laughable. There was no internal experience. It was explained away, and the reason it was explained away is because of this idea of living in a clockwork world.
Darwin countered. The Creator is nothing, nowhere. We are random mutations, simply a carrier of TNA's relentless quest for more in a meaningless universe. And meanwhile, both science and religion were hitting the wall. If everything was mechanistic and God was the holy creator, then what were we humans supposed to do? Science dug ever deeper into a dead universe and stumbled upon and unlocked a mystery.
In the material way of thinking, what happens is that we always shortchange ourselves because we cannot understand love, justice, or even meaning. So we think that the world is meaningless. Love and justice are figments of our imagination, which has no meaning in the first place.
It seems that on the one hand, say, physics is going to be urging that we look at people as if they were mechanical devices, and other kinds of discourses we have about love, about literature, about art, something like that, are going to be asking us to look at people in a very different way than that. And I'm interested at the points at which those two bang into each other. I'm interested in the points at which those two points of view that one can take on the world come into conflict with one another, come into collision with one another. And I'm interested in studying those collisions.
In tiny corners of space and time, scientists found unfathomable energy and mind-numbing mysteries. Mysteries that suggest we are all connected, that the physical universe is essentially non-physical. Time and space are just constructs of this non-materialness.
I think that by looking at where this intersection between science and religion is going to be our best way of really being able to address those issues and to go ahead and do science appropriately and morally and respectfully, but also preserve who we are as human beings, because while science can do a lot of things for us, it still doesn't necessarily change who we are as human beings, which probably is the ultimate reason why we have our problems.
Bringing mind and matter back together again is not so easy to do. The problem is we've been trained so well in science to work with the idea that mind is outside of science that we don't have any way of testing to find mind in science.
I understand the objection from physicists who say that trying to link the spookiness of quantum mechanics to the slipperiness of psychic phenomena is illegitimate. And my response is that I understand the objection. One is mathematically precise and able to be replicated easily in the laboratory, and the other one is very slippery and is full of psychological complexities and all kinds of stuff, including a history of charlatanism and imbeciles and all kinds of stuff. I mean, it's clear that that's there. So, of course, you'd want to stiff-arm the competition. On the other hand, when you look clearly at what is the fundamental thing that both of these realms say, they're talking about a form of interconnectedness.
And today, renegade scientists are meeting with religious leaders. Conferences pushing forward a meeting of science and spirit are springing up as the 20th century blew open the doors of a mechanistic view. Will the 21st century blow down the iron wall between the church and laboratory? This is your Is Newsreel reporter, signing off.
I think that there must be a scientific explanation for spirituality. I don't think there's been a good one until recently. To me, the only one that makes sense is that proto-consciousness, Platonic values, goodness, truth, exist at this fundamental level of space-time geometry, which can influence our actions if we're open to them, and interconnects us to all other beings, to the universe at large.
It's time to get wise.
Science creates the stories that we live by. And science has told us a very bleak story. It's told us that we're some sort of genetic mistake, that we have genes that use us basically to move on to the next generation, and that we randomly mutate. It's said that we are outside of our universe, that we're alone, that we're separate, and that we're this sort of lonely mistake on a lonely planet in a lonely universe. And that informs our view of the world. It informs our view of ourselves. And we're now realizing that this view of separateness, is one of the most destructive things. It's the thing that creates all the problems in the world.
It's time to get wise.
And we're now realizing that that paradigm is wrong, that we aren't separate, we are all one. We're all together. At the very nethermost element of our being, we are connected. And so we're trying to understand and absorb what are the implications of that. What does this really mean to me in my life?
We need a new spiritual milieu. We need a new spiritual way of understanding the nature of what it is to be a human being. Because the old ways, the old mythologies, the old monarchy, king, God, versus the old lawful scientist way of doing everything are dead. They need to be buried. We need a new realm, a new vision. And I think quantum physics, if anything, could help us get a step up in the right direction.
One of the reasons why, among the wide variety of things that I could have done, that I settled on psychic phenomena is because I convinced myself, through my own experiments and through watching the experiments of others, that these effects are real. And if they are real, then it means that the large bulk of science has completely sidestepped something of profound interest and probably profound importance. Because anytime science has ignored something or partitioned off this area of the world we're not going to look at, it means that, you know, we're not getting a comprehensive view of reality.
Every civilization is a reflection of its knowledge. Civilization is based upon knowledge, the prevailing paradigm. Now you look at the globe today, our rainbow-colored globe, you see arbitrary divisions among nations, among peoples. These are completely random, completely arbitrary, based upon who owned what at what period of time in history. But if somebody in the future looks back upon our globe of today, they're going to say this is a fragmented world based upon a fragmented worldview.
There was a quite noticeable shift in the thrust of the teachings of Jesus from, say, the teachings of the Old Testament. For instance, it was said to the men of old, quoting Moses, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, forgive your enemies. And he always stressed how important the thought was.
In the new paradigm, it would be certainly a lot different than it is now. I'm just thinking of how any garbage that comes into anyone's mind, any garbage is strewn out onto the airwaves. You know, children grew up hearing garbage, playing garbage, and every time to take an extreme view, every time a little man kills another little man in a computer game, I mean, something is changed in the brain of that kid.
Anytime a worldview changes, it will affect behavior, affect society, affects economy. Everything reflects the sense of what the worldview is. So if we imagine the worldview as a giant machine that's there to be exploited, then that's the way we'll do. That's what'll happen. That's the way we'll operate. That's why business goes crazy sometimes, because the nature of the game is get as much as you can. If that changes, I mean, probably the closest parallel I can think of is the ecology movement. Before an ecology movement, the notion of sustainability, of rare resources, of paying attention to the world as an organism was laughable. And we still see the effects worldwide when people don't pay attention to the fact that we're living in a closed space. There's a limited amount of stuff to use. That makes a big difference. So how will it make a difference if people imagine that the ecology extends into the mind? Well, there might be a kind of a closed space there too. You start making it dirty and putting in a bunch of bad stuff in there, you're going to end up with a bad mind environment.
I believe that children are our canaries, and they are like the canaries in the mines that were keeling over to warn the miners that they better get out. I mean, I think some of the things we're seeing with the children today is a sign that the culture is in the wrong paradigm and not appreciating the power of thought.
It may very well be that what's going on inside of you, in your brain, in your nervous system, in your nature of observation, how memory works, how mind works, it may very well be that what is happening there is some kind of observer-matter interrelationship which is indeed making things real for you, affecting how you perceive reality. It's not changing the reality out there. You're not changing big chairs and big trucks and bulldozers and rockets taking off. You're not changing those, no. But you're changing how you perceive things and maybe how you think about the things, how you feel about things, how you sense the world.
The infinite information that the brain is processing every single second tells us that there's more to the world than we're perceiving. However, every single time we're immersed in an experience with our senses, seeing, smelling, tasting, feeling, as we're immersed centrally in our reality.
We know nothing about reality, and all of our sense of so-called reality out there is filtered through our sense organs.
The brain processes 400 billion bits of information a second, but we're only aware of 2,000 of those. That means that reality is happening in the brain all the time.
You should try it. How do I know what I'm doing? I and the vase are one. Hey, it might help your work too. I live through my eyes. Acting in reality. Not just some nebulous, nothing, touchy-feely world of shifting whatevers. If it's real, I want to see it.
Reality, what a concept.
What is reality, and is it ever knowable?
The easy answer to the question as to whether reality itself is illusory and it's really all fuzzy, and it's all just probabilities. The easy answer to that would be yes. So, if I were hurrying off to a meeting instead of being interviewed and somebody came up to me, pestered me on the street and asked that question, and I'd say, yes, that's basically right. But it's more complicated than that, because at the moment that you interact with reality, it does then come into absolutely rock-solid existence. It's only fuzzy when you're not interacting with it.
When we look at some of the modern scientific views of reality that have tried to get down to the nitty-gritty, we see that at its ultimate level, say in M theory or string theory, that reality is not solid, it's mostly empty space, and whatever solidity it has seems more to resemble a hologram picture rather than material, harsh, solid reality. It's a shimmering reality that seems to be very susceptible to the power of thought.
Very powerful mystical experiences are perceived to represent a truer form of reality, a more fundamental level of reality that makes this material world really not mean as much. And some people have described it as an illusion, which I think is sometimes a little strong, but I think the point they're trying to make is that it just doesn't have the realness, the quality of realness that these states have. And the ultimate goal of the mystic then, once they've had that experience, is to kind of keep trying to get back to that experience, because that is, in their eyes, what represents the fundamental level of reality.
We have to go beyond our senses to create a new paradigm. Our senses determine everything that exists in our world. But that doesn't necessarily mean that's the end of our world. We have to embrace knowledge that's unconventional, that's in the unseen. And if we can wire it in our brain first, then what has always existed will now be seen by us. That's the paradigm shift.
You ever close your eyes when you're making love?
The eyes are like the lens, but the tape that's really seeing is the back of the brain. It's called the visual cortex. It's right back here. It's like this camera and it's tape.
The eyes are, in some senses, a camcorder, because they are taking that information and they're storing it, but you're not really able to get it to mean anything until you actually put it all together. So in some senses it requires the editor's table to really put the whole thing together, to put the movie together of what your life and your world is actually about.
The only movie that's playing in the brain is what we have the ability to see. So is it possible our eyes, our cameras see more than what our brain has the ability to consciously project?
Well, the way our brain is wired up, we only see what we believe is possible. We match patterns that already exist within ourselves through conditioning. So a wonderful story that I believe is true is that when the Indians, the Native American Indians on the Caribbean islands saw Columbus's ships approaching, they couldn't see them at all because it was so unlike anything they had ever seen before. They couldn't see it.
If I get out of bed in the morning, okay, and I suddenly decide to take very seriously the claim, which is surely a true claim, that I don't know for sure if my eyes are working correctly, okay? So that for all I know, even though it looks like there's a stable floor by the side of my bed, there might be a cliff or something like that, okay? If I am unable to order those possibilities in terms of probabilities that I assign to them, then I'm not going to get out of bed. It seems to me I'm paralyzed in the most literal sense of the word, okay? I'm going to have no idea how to literally take the next step. It's definitely the case that we know that my eyes might in principle be deceiving me at any moment. We've had experience of people before subject to hallucinations, and even if we didn't, we don't know how to prove as a fundamental matter that our eyes never deceive us. That's absolutely right. But when we make the decision to get out of bed in the morning, we are assigning probabilities to the various hypotheses compatible with my seeing a floor by the bed. One hypothesis is there really is a floor there, and that's why I'm seeing it. Another hypothesis is my seeing the floor is a hallucination, and there's a cliff there. By getting out of bed in the morning, you endorse one of those hypotheses as more likely than another.
When Columbus's armada landed in the Caribbean, none of the natives were able to see the ships, even though they existed on the horizon. The reason that they never saw the ships was because they had no knowledge in their brains or no experience that clipper ships existed. So the shaman starts to notice that there's ripples out in the ocean, but he sees no ship, but he starts to wonder what's causing the effect. So every day he goes out and looks and looks and looks, and after a period of time, he's able to see the ships. And once he sees the ships, he tells everybody else that ships exist out there because everybody trusted and believed in him. They saw them also.
By getting out of bed in the morning, you endorse one of those hypotheses as more likely than another. That's the way we're used to proceeding in our ordinary lives. Why are you doing that? You have all kinds of memories.
We always perceive something after reflection in the mirror of memory.
If I were to use a little bit of poetic license and say, well, what would happen if we could actually tap into the different parts of the processing steps of the visual, of how we actually develop vision? The information, of course, first strikes our eyes and strikes the retina, but that information that creates certain nerve signals that then connect back to the primary parts of the brain where the images really begin to form. In the very basic, the primary visual cortex, as it's called, what we would see is something a little bit like this, where we're basically just talking about lines, shapes, colors. There's nothing really there that we can actually identify or see or even talk about, and we're certainly not conscious of this level of activity. So this is really just the raw data upon which is coming into the world, but we can't make any sense of that. So in that regard, vision itself doesn't really occur in the eyes. It doesn't even occur necessarily in the primary visual area. But if we start to go up in terms of the processing, when we get to a secondary level of processing, we're beginning to coalesce forms and shapes. We may be somewhat conscious of this state, which is maybe associated with something called blind sight, where people don't have that highest level of processing where we see the vivid world, because consciously they say, I can't see. But if you ask them to guess at what they're looking at or to navigate through a room with objects in it, they can usually do so reasonably well, as if they can see. So what's going on, we don't know for sure, but it seems that there's a disconnection between the secondary and the final level of processing. So we have some degree of awareness, but it's still not really that clear, vivid rendition of reality. And that doesn't happen until we get up to the final stages of our processing, which is in what's called the visual association area. And when we see that, this is where we would see this very vivid picture of what the world is about. We see all the colors, we see everything as if we can perceive it to be very real. And not only do we have this very real perception of it, but again, these association areas, as they're called, because they associate different pieces of information across the brain, connect this picture with memory banks. And if this is a picture of a dog, it makes, we identify it as a dog. We may have an emotional response to it. If we love dogs, then we have a warm, fuzzy feeling, and if we don't like dogs, then we may not like this kind of a picture. So it depends on what your experiences have been and how you ultimately process the information that really does create for you your visual world. So the brain itself is really what is doing all of your sensing. Conversely, the thing that I've always been fascinated about on just a very simplistic level is that when you stub your toe walking, when you bang into something, your toe hurts, but it's really hurting in your brain, and it's your brain that actually perceives the hurt, but you feel it all the way down in your toe.
It's the experiment with the upside-down glasses. This man Slater built these glasses made of prisms and lenses so that you saw things upside down. And he had a group of people wear these glasses, and he asked them to sustain wearing them. It was very uncomfortable for them because they saw people sort of walking upside down. But if they kept the glasses on, then after 2 to 3 weeks, depending upon the individual, then with the glasses on, flip, they saw everything right side up. And if they took the glasses off at that point, flip, they'd see things upside down. So what happens, the way I interpret that, is that the mindset was so strong that people walk right side up, that with the glasses on, that mindset created a force to cause the neural dendrites to grow in such a way as to create an inversion mirror in the brain. And then once that hardwired structure was built, and you take the glasses off, now it has to dissolve that structure in order to see things the way you expect to see them. That's called neural learning now. We do it all the time. And I think that's the way it goes. The dilemma is people don't manifest a lot of these things because their mindset, the mindset of our world, says that we can't do those things. Those things aren't real.
You okay? I heard you scream earlier. Was it another dream? You were an Indian, watching Columbus's ship materialize out of thin air. Wow. And this medicine man kept hitting you. Cool. Hey, maybe it was a past life, or a parallel reality, or a future life. Got weird. Or maybe that dream was trying to tell you the truth. I guess it just depends on what you think is real. Maybe you should try different anxiety pills. My pills are fine, okay? Thank you. Oh. I have to go get dressed. I hope you feel better, Amanda.
God, Amanda, I could be such an asshole.
People ask me, why does quantum mechanics matter, given that it's little tiny stuff and who cares? There are 3 possible answers. From a practical point of view, it doesn't make any difference at all. I mean, you still have to go to work and drive your car and do all the rest of it. From a second point of view, it actually infiltrates everything in the world, especially the world of electronics. When you go to the supermarket and you do the scanning at the checkout, that's a quantum mechanical effect. But I think the important part is the third one, which is essentially a philosophical issue. Why are philosophers so passionate about deconstructing the assumptions of the world? I finally got it. I got it as a result of looking at quantum mechanics and comparing it to classical mechanics. They present two very different ways of thinking about the way that the world works and about what we are. So from a classical perspective, we are machines. And in machines, there's no room for a conscious experience. It doesn't matter if a machine dies, you can kill a machine, you can throw it in a dump, it doesn't matter. If that is the way that the world is, then people will behave in that way. But there's another way of thinking about the world which is suggested, it's pointed to by quantum mechanics, which suggested that the world is not this clockwork thing, but it's more like an organism. It's a highly interconnected organismic thing of some type, which extends through space and time. In that kind of environment, what I think and the way that I behave has a much greater impact, not only on myself, but on the rest of the world, than it would if it was a classical world. So from a very basic point of view having to do with morals and ethics, what I think affects the world. That's, I mean, in a sense, that's really the key for why a worldview change is important.
Let's talk about the subatomic world, and then we'll talk about what it's telling us about reality. The first thing I want to tell you about the subatomic world is it's totally a fantasy created by mad physicists trying to figure out what the heck is going on when they do these little experiments. By little experiments, I mean big energy in little spaces and little pieces of time. It gets pretty nutty at that realm of things, and so subatomic physics was invented to try to figure that all out. We need a new science down there. It's called quantum physics, and it is subject to a whole range of debatable hypotheses, thoughts, feelings, intuitions as to what the heck is really going on.
So on the one hand, you had a theory which from the conceptual standpoint was profoundly puzzling, and on the other hand, from the practical standpoint, was vastly more successful than anything we had ever seen before. This is the kind of situation that produces the tension that all of the investigations of foundations of quantum mechanics are feeding off of since then. Because on the one hand, this is an acutely paradoxical, puzzling, conceptually confusing theory. On the other hand, we have no option along the lines of throwing it out or neglecting it, because it is the most powerful, proven tool for predicting the behaviors of physical systems that we have ever had in our hands.
The universe is very strange. There seem to be two sets of laws that govern the universe. In our everyday classical world, meaning at roughly our size and time scales, things are described by Newton's laws of motion, set down hundreds and hundreds of years ago. And they work very well for billiard balls and cannonballs and gravity. However, when we get down to a small scale, when we get down to, say, the level of atoms, a different set of laws take over. These are the quantum laws, quantum theory, quantum mechanics. And at that level, particles may be in multiple places at the same time. They may behave as waves smeared out spatially and temporally. They may be interconnected over great distances. They may be unified into one quantum state, into one state, governed by one wave function. And the borderline, the threshold, this curtain between the quantum world and the classical world is really mysterious. It's called sometimes the collapse of the wave function, because at the quantum world, everything is in superposition of multiple possibilities, and in the classical world, these multiple possibilities seem to collapse to particular definite choices. So everything is in one particular place.
When electrons move about the atomic nucleus, they do so in orbits. You have seen such models of the atom in high school books. You can easily recall them. But the subtle part comes when we think of how does the electron jump from one orbit to the other. A jump that is associated with the emission of light from atoms. Atoms emit light in the process. But how does the electron jump from one orbit to another? Niels Bohr was the first one to point this out, and it's radical. Electrons never go through the intermediate space, to the intervening space. Electrons never traverse any space in making this transition. They just are in the higher orbit, and then they are in the lower orbit. No space in between. So how does one make the jump? If you think in terms of continuity of movement, you can't find answers to that. So quantum fundamentally then means a discontinuity. This word quantum, originally it just meant a quantity. In Latin it just means quantity. But that's not the way we use it in quantum physics. From the beginning, we used the word quantum in quantum physics to signify discreteness, and now signify a quantum leap, a discontinuous movement.
Quantum mechanics guarantees that the deeper you go, the more energetic nature becomes. It's for this reason that nuclear power is 1,000,000 times more powerful than chemical power. Why? Because chemical power represents a molecular manipulation. Nuclear power emerges from a nuclear manipulation, but the nucleus is 1,000,000 times smaller and 1,000,000 times more fundamental and 1,000,000 times more powerful than the chemical level. So the deeper you go, the smaller you go, quantum mechanics says, the more dynamic you become. The unified field exists at the ultimate scale of the Planck scale, 10 to the minus 33 centimeters.
The Planck scale is the very smallest level of reality. If we go down in scale, we're at meters, centimeters. If we go down to atoms, they're 10 to the minus 8th centimeters. Keep going down and down and down. Space-time is smooth until we get to the basement floor, the bottom level, where there's a pattern. There's a fabric, if you will. There's some kind of coarseness or irregularity. And that's at what's called the Planck scale, after Max Planck, the German physicist, at roughly 10 to the minus 33 centimeters. And the Planck time is 10 to the minus 43 seconds. So things are very, very small and happen very, very fast. Now, despite the fact that they're very, very small, space-time is everywhere. So the entire universe is created of this level. And Einstein's relativity says when this fabric curves up, it forms mass, and that's what matter is made of.
The notion that things that we touch with our hands, feel, are made of ideas or concepts actually is probably an older idea than we might have thought. And it's a difficult idea to really grasp or get a hold of. But let me try to explain it this way. When we began to look at small corners of space and little pieces of time, we began to see that the objects that we discovered in these regions of space and time weren't just persistently existing. They were kind of popping like bubbles in bubble wrap. Pop, 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 on and off, on and off. And in order to explain that, we wondered what they were doing when they weren't appearing as pops. What were they before that? Then we did more refined experiments, and we found that we could take objects and let them interact and fly apart, and then measure something about one of the objects, and we'd find that the other object would also change at the same time that the first object was even looked at. In other words, if something popped over here, instantly the other one would pop, whereas if we hadn't popped this one would just pop randomly. So how could pop 1 be connected to pop 2 when they weren't separated? So this gradually led into some notions that there was an invisible connection between everything. Physicists give this a name. They call it entanglement. Or we now speak of it in terms of a state or an invisible state. We call it a state vector or a quantum wave function because it seems wavy. It seems spread out over space and time rather than concentrically localized in one place at one time. However, this wave function isn't just a wave of matter like an ocean wave or a sound wave or any kind of wave of matter. It's a wave of possibility. It's a kind of thought wave. And because it is a wave of thought or possibility or not matter, it's invisible to us. But we can't explain what we do see as matter in these small corners of space and time unless we picture that these matter particles somehow come out from or emerge from these thought wave patterns which are invisible to us.
Quantum mechanics is really the play and display of information, the play and display of potentiality, waves of information, waves of potential electron. And it's important, the word potential. This isn't the world of electrons, it's the world of potential electrons. But when you have to ask the question, waves of what, really? What is the field that is waving? Is it the ocean? No, it's a universal ocean, an ocean of pure potentiality. an ocean of abstract potential existence. We call it the unified field, or superstring field. And that's what we're made of.
Connectivity among all things is a basic constituent of the fabric of reality. It's very difficult to wrap your mind around that. But Erwin Schrödinger said, he's one of the founders of quantum mechanics, that entanglement, which is this idea of this connectivity, is not just a property of quantum mechanics, it's the property. It's the property of quantum mechanics that makes it very, very strange. And it doesn't seem to fit in with our ordinary world, our ordinary experience, but in fact, it actually does.
You want to shoot some hoops? No, you don't have to be like that. Come on and play. Look, he likes you. Don't you have time for a little one-on-one? How long has it been since you played? Come on, you got the ball. Take a shot. No, my lady, not from there. It's out of bounds. Gotta be on the court to be in play. Welcome to Duke Reginald's court of unending possibilities. Gotta sink the last one.
That hurt.
It never touched you.
Right.
And it's not solid. This ball is mostly empty.
We were all taught in school that the world is made of stuff, of matter, of mass, of atoms. Atoms make up molecules, molecules make up materials, and everything is made of that. But atoms actually are mostly empty. For example, if this ball were the nucleus of an atom, a proton in a hydrogen atom, for example, then the electron circling this, which would describe the outer limits of that atom, would be out by that mountain over there, roughly 20 miles away. And everything in between is empty. In fact, the universe is mostly empty. However, when we go down in scale, in the emptiness, we eventually come to a level, the fundamental level of space-time geometry, the fine basement level of the universe, where there's information, there's a pattern. It's called the Planck scale, and it's the fabric of the universe. And at that level, there's information that's been there since the Big Bang. So most of the universe, even of matter, is actually empty.
Most people think that the vacuum is empty. But for internal consistency of quantum mechanics and relativity theory, there is required to be the equivalent of 10 to the 94 grams of mass energy, each gram being E equals mc squared kind of energy. Now that's a huge number, but what does it mean practically? Practically, if I can assume that the universe is flat, and more astronomical data is showing it's pretty darn flat. If I can assume that, then if I take the volume or take the vacuum within a single hydrogen atom, that's about 10 to the minus 23 cubic centimeters. If I take that amount of vacuum and I take the latent energy in that, there is 1 trillion times more energy there than in all of the mass of all of the stars and all of the planets out to 20 billion light years. That's big. That's big. And if consciousness allows you to control even a small fraction of that, creating a Big Bang is no problem.
Organizations like NASA, British Aerospace, are all trying to tap into this incredible, unimaginably large energy sea. And they feel if they can tap this, we can travel to different galaxies. So they understand that in empty space, there is this unbelievable energy.
When you begin to really grasp this, you begin to grasp the enormity of the energy that would be involved in going down this rabbit hole. What is available for us to use in the future to take us to the stars? The issue is we are perturbing this with consciousness. We are able to, with directed consciousness and intention, we are changing things at the vacuum level, which then allow us to access a new level of physics. So we can do that at that level, not so much at the atom molecule level. That's a secondary effect. So we're already doing it in essence. We're already getting into the rabbit hole by using intention.
We're really living in a thought universe, a conceptual universe. Quantum mechanics is just the play and display of potentiality.
If you put it that there is an intangible world that affects the tangible world of our experience, and if you then say that's what quantum mechanics says, and granted that's a fair way of trying to put into English something which is very, very difficult to grasp, but it then leads quite naturally to the conclusion that quantum mechanics says that there is a spiritual world that makes this choice, that there's another world that is intangible, that affects and influences the physical world. And really, while that statement might be true, quantum mechanics absolutely does not say that. That intangibility, however, is itself the bedrock of physical reality. It may be intangible, but it is, and we can't really say what it is or why it's there, but it is in fact the most fundamental feature of matter. So you could say, well, if it's a feature of matter, that's not intangible. Matter is the most tangible of things. So, these are word games. The fact of the matter is that the matter is not what we have long thought it to be. To the scientist, matter has always been thought of as sort of the ultimate in that which is static and predictable. And the more you understand the material aspect of something, the more perfectly predictable it is. What quantum mechanics illustrates is that that is simply not true.
The major basic idea that quantum physics implies, which makes us understand this or even think about this new paradigm, the thing which is that there's this underground, there's got to be a realm of existence which cannot be ever touched on or seen, which bubbles into the existence giving rise to our understanding of the world.
The tighter physics have tried to grasp onto physical reality, to understand what it's really made of. What are the core building blocks of life? At the basis of it all, life, the universe, slips through your fingers. And you come up with something that's increasingly abstract to come to the realm of pure abstraction. And that's what the unified field is. It's pure abstract potential, pure abstract being, pure abstract self-aware consciousness, which rises in waves of vibration to give rise to the particles, the people, everything we see in the vast universe.
What makes up things are not more things, but what makes up things are ideas, concepts, information.
And like I said, it never touches.
Another strange fact is that objects never really touch each other. When I dribble this ball, the atoms of the ball and the atoms of the ground never actually meet.
So nobody touches nothing. Come on, put your stuff down. Nobody's gonna take it. Like I said, this is my court. It's no problem.
I create.
The first inkling in physics that we got that time ain't what it seemed to be came with relativity. That was the first inkling that time was not absolute, it was not the absolute ruler of the universe, that God Almighty did not say 1 second, 1 second, 1 second, 1 second, 1 meter, 1 meter, 1 meter. You're in a gravitational field. Your head is actually moving at a slightly faster rate than your feet.
The second law of thermodynamics says that things unwind and move forward, so that gives an arrow of time. But at the quantum world, in the micro world, the second law of thermodynamics doesn't seem to hold, and things can go backwards or be timeless.
The fundamental equations of motion that we have, both in classical mechanics and in quantum mechanics, have this property called time reversal symmetry. Okay? That is, there's a certain way in which they don't distinguish between the past and the future. Or to put it slightly differently, these equations entail that for any process that's possible, the same process happening backwards is possible. Now, when I say happening backwards, I don't mean going backwards in time. I mean, as time goes forward, the reverse sequence of things happens. Okay. The world isn't like that. There are all sorts of what people refer to as time asymmetries in the world. And people usually chop these asymmetries up into 3 different levels. Level 1, there are all sorts of ordinary physical processes, ice melting, smoke spreading out in a room, people getting wrinkly as they get old, so on and so forth, that we never see happening in reverse. 2, we have a very different kind of epistemic access to the past than we do to the future. That is, the ease with which we can know things about the past and the way in which we come to know things about the past and the detail with which we can know things about the past is utterly different than the ease and the access and the detail that we have to the future. 3, an asymmetry of influence. We have a very deep conviction that by acting now, we can affect the future, but not the past. Given the complete time symmetry of the fundamental equations of motion, all of these 3 asymmetries are extremely mysterious. And moreover, they're asymmetries that play an incredibly fundamental role in every second of our lives. That's been a puzzle hanging over physics for a long time. Where does this asymmetry come from, if not the equations of motion? The equations of motion are supposed to be the whole story about how the world works. But in that story, these asymmetries don't show up at all. And yet, these asymmetries are profound, ubiquitous, inescapable features of every second of our lives in the world.
One of the most unpalatable ideas still, in spite of the fact that quantum physics has been around a long time, is the possibility or the notion that the future can have a causative effect on the present. We believe that the past can have a causative effect on the present. I hold the ball, I drop it, it falls. Cause, effect when it hits the ground. But could the ground be the cause of my dropping the ball in the first place?
It's only in conscious experience that it seems that we move forward in time. In quantum theory, you can also go backwards in time, and there's some suggestion that processes in the brain related to consciousness project backwards in time. For example, in the late 1970s, a neurophysiologist at University of California, San Francisco, named Ben Libet did some very famous experiments. What Libet did was to study patients who were having neurosurgery on their brains, with their brains exposed, while they were awake. They were given a local anesthetic to numb the area of the skull and scalp to access their brains. And they were awake, and Ben would talk to these people. So, for example, what he did was he would stimulate their little finger and look at the part of the sensory cortex on the opposite side that was related to that, record from it electrically, and ask the patient when he or she felt the stimulus on the little finger. And he would also stimulate at that particular area of cortex. Now, what you would think would be that if you stimulate the little finger, it takes a finite period of time to get to the opposite side of the cortex, so the patient would report it a fraction of a second later after the stimulus. And when you stimulate it directly, the patient would report it immediately. He found just the opposite. When he stimulated the little finger, the patient felt it immediately, and when he stimulated directly in the cortex, there was a delay. After sorting through all the data and repeating this over and over, Libet came to the conclusion that somehow the brain was projecting information backwards in time, so that it did take a finite amount of time to get to the sensory cortex, but the brain projected it backwards in time so that the conscious perception was that the stimulus was felt when the pinch actually occurred.
There have been some studies which have shown that when people are beginning to move a hand or beginning to say something, that there's actually activity in the brain in certain nerve cells of the brain, even before they become consciously aware of what they're trying to do.
In baseball, a scientist showed that if you study how a batter can hit a pitch coming at 100 miles an hour, considering the recognition, the visual processing, the motor response, the reflexes, synaptic delays, it's impossible. That was his conclusion. How could it be accomplished? Well, one possibility is that as the batter is standing there, the ball comes across the plate and the batter sees where the ball is and recognizes it and decides where to swing by the time the ball is already in the catcher's mitt. But the information is projected backwards in time so that he or she swings at the previous time when the ball is just coming across the plate. This could be happening all the time in our normal everyday consciousness. And there's some other experiments that have shown this. Dick Bierman and Dean Radin have done some experiments where a subject sits at a computer screen and watches a series of images which may be somewhat bland or may have highly emotional content, and they just study their galvanic skin responses, a means of emotion. And they vary the timing of when the picture is going to occur, so the subject doesn't know exactly when it's going to occur. And what they find is that, not surprisingly, the emotional pictures give a much greater response, but that both the emotional and the unemotional responses show up a half a second to 2 seconds before the stimulus actually occurs on the screen. And a fellow named Chester Wiley replicated this not only in humans but in worms. So this may be possibly a very widespread phenomenon of backwards projection in time. The only explanation is through quantum physics.
Pat Price he was a fantastic remote viewer, and he was supposed to draw where his traveler was going as usual. And he drew 2 tanks and a swimming pool. And when the investigators looked at it, the scientists said, Pat must have just got it wrong this time, because he was right about the swimming pool. They had sent their traveling partner to the municipal swimming pool in Palo Alto. And they said, Pat just got it wrong this time. Months later, one of the scientists received something from the Palo Alto Chamber of Commerce, and it had images of the municipal swimming pool 50 years earlier. And what they saw was the swimming pool, but 2 tanks exactly where Pat had drawn them. And so what Pat's mind had done was not to see what the swimming pool was in present time. He saw it back as it was 50 years ago.
I know it seems to me that I often do things and then decide a fraction of a second later what to do, but I've already done them.
We're beginning to see that even time itself is not sacrosanct. We're allowed now to get into it in a different way. David Deutsch, Oxford physics professor, was, I think, one of the prime inventors of quantum computation, the quantum computer, and he is very much into parallel universes and time travel, and says all the paradoxes now of time travel. You can go backwards in time and knock off your father and mother before they have you and come back, and you're still alive, and no paradox. And even to explain that is difficult to do, but nevertheless, put them in a parallel universe and it's no problem. So these are the kinds of things we're doing in physics right now. We're rethinking time, and it may very well be that the next phase of time travel in a physical device may be in the next 50 to 100 years from now.
Science suggests to us that parallel universes are living simultaneously, that we're living 100,000 lives or 5 lives, however much you can handle, simultaneously, and that all the things that we do are at work right now.
I'll be late. You can always go back in time. What's the matter? Remember, it's empty.
How do you know this shit?
I read Dr. Quantum comics. Everybody thinks it's just kid stuff, and I know it's real. That's how I do my magic on the court.
So, what they taught us in school isn't really the way it is, and that our senses are playing tricks on us. You just gotta wonder, what is this reality that we find ourselves in? Quantum physics says it's all just waves of information. Do I believe that? I hope so. Yikes!
That's how I do my magic on the court.
Yeah, I always choose the Wonder Boy first.
Well, Dr. Quantum says everybody's got it. Everybody's doing it constantly, each and every time you look.
And here we are, the granddaddy of all quantum weirdness, the infamous double-slit experiment.
The first people who did these experiments, and these experiments of, experiments, crude experiments of this kind, were first performed almost 50 years ago, or more, 60 years ago. Those people were flabbergasted.
To understand this experiment, we first need to see how particles, or little balls of matter, act. If we randomly shoot a small object, say a marble, at the screen, we see a pattern on the back wall where they went through the slit and hit. Now, if we add a second slit, we would expect to see a second band duplicated to the right. Now, let's look at waves. The waves hit the slit and radiate out, striking the back wall with the most intensity directly in line with the slit. The line of brightness on the back screen shows that intensity. This is similar to the line the marbles make. But when we add the second slit, something different happens. If the top of one wave meets the bottom of another wave, they cancel each other out. So now there is an interference pattern on the back wall. Places where the two tops meet are the highest intensity, the bright lines, and where they cancel, there is nothing. So, when we throw things, that is, matter, through two slits, we get this, two bands of hits. And with waves, we get an interference pattern of many bands. Good so far. Now, let's go quantum.
This is just to break down your prejudice that says a particle is a particle. Now you got to understand it's a particle and a wave.
An electron is a tiny, tiny bit of matter, like a tiny marble. Let's fire a stream through one slit. It behaves just like the marble, a single band. So, if we shoot these tiny bits through two slits, we should get, like the marbles, two bands. What? An interference pattern. We fired electrons, tiny bits of matter through. But we get a pattern like waves, not like little marbles. How? How could pieces of matter create an interference pattern like a wave? It doesn't make sense.
You got to understand it's a particle and a wave. Now that you've taken that leap, let's get one step closer to the reality. It ain't either of those either. And it's both at the same time.
But physicists are clever. They thought, maybe those little balls are bouncing off each other and creating that pattern. So they decide to shoot electrons through one at a time. There is no way they could interfere with each other. But after an hour of this, the same interference pattern is seen to emerge. The conclusion is inescapable. The single electron leaves as a particle, becomes a wave of potentials, goes through both slits, and interferes with itself to hit the wall like a particle. But mathematically, it's even stranger. It goes through both slits, and it goes through neither. And it goes through just one, and it goes through just the other. All of these possibilities are in superposition with each other.
We did these experiments and we got certain results. And in the light of these results, we asked a question of the form, gee, which path could the electron have taken through this two paths apparatus? And if there are two options like that, it's just a matter of standard classical logic, there are four logical possibilities. A, B, both, neither, okay? We went through those possibilities one by one and designed an experiment in each case to test that possibility. And the answer in each of the four cases was negative, okay? It doesn't go through root A. How do we know that? Because when we put in a total of nothing box in root A, it has an effect on this particle. But total of nothing boxes don't have any effect on particles that pass through them. It doesn't go through root B for the same reason. It doesn't go through both roots because if we stop the experiment in the middle, we always find it either on one root or the other, but not both. And it doesn't take neither root because if we just block up the two roots and leave everything else open, nothing gets through. So we can systematically, piece by piece, eliminate all of the four logical possibilities, okay, given the assumption that it makes sense to ask the question, which route did it take? That's how we're forced into a position, gee, the only thing left to do here, it's analogous to, think about the case of inquiring into the marital status of the number 5. Somebody says, gee, is the number 5 married? You say, no, that's not the right thing to say. The guy says, I see, number 5 is a bachelor. You say, no, that's not right either. The guy says, well, what else is there? You say, look, the deal about the number 5 is it's not married, it's not a bachelor. That's not a logical contradiction. The trouble here is that the whole question of the marital status of the number 5 is a question that can't sensibly be raised. That's what we're finding out about these particles. We say, did it take root A? We can eliminate it experimentally. Did it take root B? We can eliminate that experimentally. Did it take both? We can eliminate that. Did it take neither? We can eliminate that. All that leaves us with is going this route that we go with the number 5. Oh, I see. Although in this case it's astonishing. With the case of the number 5, it was easy. What this must be telling us is that it somehow fails to make sense even to raise the question in a situation like this. Which route did the particle take?
Physicists were completely baffled by this. So they decided to peek and see which slit it actually goes through. They put a measuring device by one slit to see which one it went through and let it fly. But the quantum world is far more mysterious than they could have imagined. When they observed, the electron went back to behaving like a little marble. It produced a pattern of 2 bands, not an interference pattern of many. The very act of measuring or observing which slit it went through meant it only went through one, not both. The electron decided to act differently, as though it was aware it was being watched.
So the electron is very peculiar. The electron is very peculiar in the sense that when you are not looking, electron can be here, can be there, or can be over there in the corner of this room. It can be all over this room, so to speak. But whenever we look, this is the strange thing about these electrons. Whenever we look, we always find them to be in one particular Geiger counter, although we may have a room full of Geiger counters. We never hear the Geiger counter sticking all over the room. This is the fundamentally important stuff about the electrons.
It was here that physicists stepped forever into the strange never-world of quantum events. What is matter? Marbles or waves? And waves of what? And what does an observer have to do with any of this? The observer collapsed the wave function simply by observing.
We are always the observer. But sometimes we identify with the event so much so that we even lose the aspect of the observer. That's why the materialist gets totally lost and thinks that we could do without the observer.
The physics data tells us that, that an object itself is really a simplification for what we call out there. One is particularly when we're looking at atomic and subatomic particles or atomic and subatomic matter in any form. What we find is how we go to look at it, what we choose to examine it with, actually changes the properties of what we observe to be out there.
Is this the observer, and which is so intricate to understanding the wacky, weird world of quantum particles and how they react? Is this, then, the observer? And even though we cannot have a quantum field without the observation of scientists who have gone there, who have uncovered it, layer after layer after layer, they're all observers. But not one of them agree conclusively on all points in the field, because they are perceiving the field mathematically from different angles of perception.
Mathematics shows us clearly that the movement of objects are describable only in terms of possibilities, not the actual events that happens in our experience. Quantum physics calculates only possibilities. But if we accept this, then the question immediately comes, what chooses among these possibilities to bring the actual event of experience? So we directly, immediately see that consciousness must be involved. The observer cannot be ignored. Observer is part of the description of the world, but the observer is not included in quantum physics. We can only describe the objects, not the subject. So we get the idea that the subject must be more fundamental than the objects. Consciousness is more fundamental.
We don't know in quantum mechanics how to hook ourselves as observers up with the world. We don't know how to treat ourselves as observers as just another part of the physical system that we're describing. The only way we know how to do quantum mechanics as it's traditionally formulated is to keep the observer outside of the system you're describing. The minute you put him in, you get all these paradoxes. And we're forced to say things in quantum mechanics like, look, the book is doing what it's doing because of quantum mechanics, and I see that because I'm there and I see it, and you better not try to analyze that second part of the sentence in terms of applying quantum mechanics to it, because it's going to break down. That's why there are these two separate laws of the evolutions of physical systems. One that applies when you're not looking at them, the other that applies when you are. But that's crazy.
There's no way that we're ever going to mathematize or put into mathematical formula this very act in which a conscious observer comes up with the answer. People say, oh, the measuring instruments, the recorder records it, and there it is, it's on the tape, it's recorded. You forgot one part of the equation. Somebody has to look at the tape. And until somebody looks at the tape, it ain't recorded at all. Until there's an ear, there is no sound in the forest.
The extreme view would be idealism, Bishop Berkeley and the Hindu approach, which says that consciousness is all there is. And that all there is my consciousness. I'm creating you and the camera and the world around me, and all there is me. But that is a view that's impossible to refute, because I can't really prove that you are out there in reality and have your own consciousness, and you can't prove that I'm conscious. So idealism, both from the Western standpoint, from what Bishop Berkeley said, and the Hindu tradition, is one possibility. Another possibility, you know, the Copenhagen interpretation says we create reality by an observation collapses the wave function. The problem with that is it doesn't say what observation is. It doesn't say what consciousness is. You know, why is our brain different from a measuring device or anything else? And it kind of puts consciousness outside science. So my view is somewhere in the middle with the Penrose objective reduction, where you have a superposition which reaches threshold and self-collapses and chooses a reality at that point of a number. It's kind of a multiple choice. It's not like starting from scratch anything you want. It's a multiple choice of multiple possibilities for each specific collapse. But the beauty is, according to, this is one of Roger's great contributions, I think, is that he said the Platonic information embedded in the fundamental level of the universe helps to choose or influences which choice is made. And this only occurs in the objective reduction. So if you make a conscious choice, if you're mindful about it and don't act rashly, you know, or reflexively, maybe think about it and allow yourself to be influenced by what you want to call instinct or intuition or your higher power or the way of the Tao or may the force be with you, however you want to put it, the quantum information embedded at the Planck scale will influence your decision one way or the other for the good, generally. So it's kind of a way of bringing in some kind of spiritual divine guidance, if you will.
One of the important innovations of quantum mechanics is that a certain fantasy that held in physics up until then about the possibility of observing something entirely passively, observing it without affecting it in the process of observing it. However things turn out, it's fairly clear now that quantum mechanics will have ended that permanently. Looking at things involves interacting with them, and it involves interacting with them in a way whose effect can't be minimized, no matter how delicate your technology is.
Ultimately, science says we have an influence on the observed. Strict separability, strict objectivity, where we can stand back and observe nature without really entering into nature and even modifying nature. That strict separability is no longer possible. We understand that now from quantum mechanics. At the very core of life, the very foundation of experience, it's all created by consciousness. The very earliest experience, the beginning of the universe, you could say, is when pure consciousness, the unified field, seeing itself, creates within its essentially unified nature the threefold structure of observer, observed, and process of observation. From that, at that deepest level of reality, consciousness creates creation.
The observer does have a tremendous impact on what reality is all about. And because of how consciousness works for us as human beings, because of the possible effects that consciousness may have on things that are out there in the world, we can see that there is some relationship between what is observed and what the observer is doing. So if in that regard the observer has the ability to affect what is being observed, then yes, there is some way in which the observer can ultimately impact or affect the thing that you are in fact trying to look at.
Problem with the observer is it the man who makes the breakthrough in quantum uncertainty, for example, Heisenberg's principle. Did a great thing when he did that, because he realized that there was uncertainty that even he couldn't observe, but only as uncertainty. And that only meant that someone else was guiding them to their own chaotic destiny.
When you are not looking, electron can be here, can be there, or can be over there in the corner of this room. But whenever we look, we always find them to be in one Geiger counter.
Quantum mechanics is shot through and through with certain key features. Key meaning that they're critical to what quantum effects are. They undergird the entire structure of matter and the physical universe. They are very well describable in mathematical terms, and they obey certain probabilistic laws that can be written down and seem never to be violated, and yet they are completely beyond understanding. For instance, what we were just talking about, superposition, and the notion that something can exist in two places at once and yet be in neither of those two places. Okay, well, that's a perfectly good English sentence, I think. But you can't actually make sense out of it. And I can write an equation that basically says in mathematical terms what I just said in English, that gives the probability that if you look, you'll find the object to the left, and a certain other probability that when you look, you'll find it to the right. So that's all neat and clean, and the mathematics of it brooks no contradiction. But to say that before you look, the object is in both places and yet neither, and it isn't that when you look, like lifting a shell up in a shell game, and you know either the bead is there or it isn't there. It isn't that way. Before you take the shell up, the bead isn't under either shell, and it's also under both. And which one it ends up being, when you pick the shell up, whether the bead is there or isn't there, is not determined by anything, and doesn't actually even come into existence until the moment that you pick the shell up.
It isn't that the particle is in more than one place at once. It's rather that the particle is in a situation in which questions about its position can't even be raised, in which questions about its position don't even make sense, in which asking about the particle's position has the same logical status as asking about the political affiliations of a tuna sandwich, like I said, or the marital status of the number 5.
Particles. Back to particles.
They're not matter, and they're not energy, they're not even in space, they're not even in time. They are patterns which we perceive as a way of understanding what's going on in this realm, this gooey realm that we can't get our hands into. It's our way of understanding. It allows us to make predictions. It gives us a handle on what's going on, but it ain't the whole story by any means.
Answer number 2. Particles aren't really what they seem to be. They're momentary manifestations, momentary poppings of this deeper imaginary realm, this wave-like realm, this implicate order, as David Bohm would say it, this quantum wavy function, as quantum physicists might talk about it, in which there is no particle. There's just this waviness which can spontaneously pop out as particles. So where do they go when they're not in particle? They're in wave world, or in the alternate universe world, where the people in that universe are asking the same question about those particles when they come into our universe. They say, where do they go? The best way I can describe it is, when you ain't looking, it's like a wave. When you are looking, it's like a particle.
Answer number 3, they went into the rabbit hole.
Superheroes use superposition, with the world being potential strips of reality, until we choose. Heroes choose what they want, being in many places at once, experiencing many possibilities all at once, and then collapsing on the one. The question is, how far down the rabbit hole do you want to go?
I think we love rabbit holes so much because we realize that there is a greater reality out there, and that the reality is much more akin to our dreams.
Your own mind is creating multiple possibilities in your subconscious. The superpositions of possibilities are in your subconscious. I mean, you may be consciously aware of them, but they exist, I think, in superposition of multiple possibilities, which after a while will collapse to one or the other.
Project or plan into the future or cast a thought ahead of itself.
Nice shot.
"50 years ago, we were trying to understand the electron. And for God's sakes, the thing turns out to be a wave function. okay? It's a wave. You can't localize it. You try to localize it. It really slips through your fingers. It's impossible to localize. So for a while, we got used to the fact that, okay, there are no particles ultimately. There are just waves. It's called a wave function. When you go deeper into physics and you really try to get a handle on what the wave function is, you localize that wave, and the wave slips through your fingers because the wave actually gets replaced in quantum field theory with something more abstract that doesn't even have a shape. It must be described instead as a simultaneous coexistence of all possible shapes. It's not even a self-respecting wave. It's something more abstract than that. It has slipped through your fingers again. And then when you get beyond quantum field theory to unified field theory, you try to even grasp the nature of that quantum field, which is already abstract, and you end up with something that's pure being, absolutely beyond the intellect to even describe. Pure abstractness, pure potentiality, pure existence.
But the great-great-granddaddy of wacky quantum weirdness is entanglement. If time reversal symmetry destroys the notion of time, then entanglement crushes our experience of space. Two objects, two electrons created together, are entangled. Send one to the other side of the universe. Now, do something to one, and the other responds instantly. Instantly. So, either information is traveling infinitely fast, or, in reality, they are still connected. They are entangled. And since everything was entangled at the moment of the Big Bang, that means everything is still touching. Space is just the construct that gives the illusion that there are separate objects. Are we far enough down the rabbit hole yet?
To go down the rabbit hole and to get away from the mundane is thrilling. Everybody secretly is an adventurer. When we head down a rabbit hole, we have to reformat all of our knowledge and our present understanding, and we have to be able to combine knowledge in a different way than we've processed it up until this point. It means that we have to step outside the box of our most familiar, most common way of thinking. We have to begin to perceive the question or the understanding from a different point of view. And in order to do that, you have to mix circuits in the brain.
It's tricky. I don't know if you want to go there. You do want to go there? So, entanglement is space separated and time separated. One way of looking very specifically at the time separation aspect, it's much easier to do this with one individual rather than two. Because who are you better entangled with than anyone? It's yourself. It's your future self that you're entangled with, and your past self. So the experiment that I developed to look at this is we wire you up typically to look at skin conductance, but also heart rate and other parameters. You will sit in front of a computer screen and you press a button, and you know that 5 seconds later you're going to see a picture. It could be a very calm picture, or it might be a very emotional picture. And it's randomly selected by the computer immediately before it's shown. So when you press the button, the future is not yet determined. So you need real precognition in order to be able to jump into the future and get it somehow. So since we're looking at your physiology, we know what happens to physiology after you see an emotional image. And we know what happens after you see a calm image. The question is, does that future experience leak into your present? Does it happen before you see the picture? And through this experiment, you can see what happens. Electrical activity of the heart, EKG. This is photoplethysmograph, which is the amount of blood in the fingertip. And respiration, breathing in, breathing out. Press the button, well, what happens to physiology? Well, if it starts rising before the image appears, it may suggest that you're about to get an emotional picture. And if it stays calm, it suggests maybe you're going to get a calm picture. So we've done this kind of experiment for several hundred people, and colleagues have run this experiment as well. And as it turns out, that is exactly what you see. People become aroused before randomly selected pictures in the future that happen to be emotional, and they remain calm before randomly selected pictures that are calm. This has been seen in heart rate changes, in skin conductance, in the brain, and basically systemically throughout the body. We are entangled with our future selves.
Wormholes are topological fluctuations, really channels of communication that connect distant parts of the universe instantaneously. Even time travel is possible.
The way I understand a rabbit hole is that it is a portal to another reality. Now, that could be the most banal thing in the world. You know, if I just open a door and go through it, portal means very little in that sense. But in the sense we're talking about it here, we're talking about how we access another dimension of reality.
You now can see in numerous labs around the United States objects that are large enough to be seen by the naked eye, and they are in two places simultaneously. And you can actually take a photograph of that. Now, I suppose if you showed a photograph, they'd say, oh, great, here's this nice blob of colored light, and I see there's a bit of it over here, and another bit of it. So you got a picture of two dots. What's the big deal? Superposition is pre-detection. What I was speaking about in the film is post-detection. Now, under normal circumstances, a single object, once it has been detected, is in just one position. However, there are states of matter that have been created now in which objects can be in multiple positions simultaneously, not just two, but actually as many as 3,000 positions. The first of these objects were called Bose-Einstein condensates. And they are single wave functions, meaning they are single particles. But even though they're a single wave function, the wave function has multiple positions. And if you say, well, look right in the chamber, you can see it right there. Oh, I see two things there. You say, no, that's not two things. That's one thing. It's the same thing in two places. Tricky point here is that it's still a single wave function. It's not 3,000 separate wave functions. It's one wave function. So it's one particle. I'm not sure that people's jaw would drop about it because I don't think people really believe it. And I don't mean that people say, oh, you're lying, or, oh, the scientists are confused. I think it is so mysterious that you can't even understand how amazing it is. One particle in 3,000 different locations.
Now, if you were to weigh one of them, would it weigh 1/3,000th?
Well, you can't weigh one of them.
Why?
Because it's one particle. It's one indivisible particle.
But if it's in different locations, can't you put a scale under one?
No, it's inseparable. It's not a set. This is the tricky conceptual part that it's not 3,000 separate parts.
Even though it looks that way.
Right. You can look at it, and I mean, you can't actually see the one with 3,000, but you can look at the simpler ones, the ones that are 2 or 3 or 4, and you can see, as I say, if you go onto the web, you'll see photographs of these. You'll see these little dots floating in space, and these are the different parts of one object. They're not separable. It's not 4 different objects or 6 different objects. It's one wave function. It's one object.
That's a real brain fart, isn't it? Because when you think about it, you just, wait a minute, no. They're like here. So it's obviously 1, 2, 3.
No, you can't, and you can't pull one away from the others. If you try to pull one away from the others, the entire thing will just disappear. And then furthermore, you've seen Star Trek and whatnot. Beam me up, Scotty.
Beam me up, Scotty.
Get lost forever down the rabbit hole.
How far down the rabbit hole do
Be
you...
in the mystery.
So it all seems sort of oh, well, what does that really mean? But you've got to really stop and think about what that means, that it's the same object and it's in two places at once. And people tinker in the lab and they get angry about things and they have lunch and they go home and they lead their lives just as though nothing utterly astounding is happening, because of course that's how you have to go about it. And yet there is this completely amazing magic sitting right in front of your eyes.
We took two simple black boxes like this. Inside is a very simple electric circuit with a few diodes, oscillator, EEPROM, some resistors and capacitors. Basically that's it. We wrap one in aluminum foil. We put it in an electrically grounded Faraday cage. The other we set on a tabletop around which 4 very well qualified meditators, highly inner self-managed individuals sit. And they go into a deep meditative state. They cleanse the environment. They make it essentially a sacred space using their mind cleansing procedures and their intentions. And then one of the 4 speaks the specific intention for this device. The intention is to influence a particular target experiment. Might be to increase the pH of purified water by 1 full pH unit, or to decrease the pH by 1 full pH unit. We've used these devices on all those experiments and have been robustly successful. In the meditative process, then after one speaks the particular intention, it's held various ways by the 4 for maybe 15 minutes, and then so be it, it's let go. And then a subsidiary intention is stated to seal that imprint into the device. We take one of these devices with this aluminum foil, we put it in a soft package, we put it in a FedEx packet, we ship it 2,000 miles away to the laboratory we were using up in Minnesota. And as soon as it arrives there, it goes into its own electrically grounded Faraday cage. The next day we do the same with the control. The experiment is running, and basically then one just takes the device out, sets it beside the experiment within 6 inches to a foot, and turns it on for a period of time. That's it. Now, we learned over some period of time that there was another factor. We found that the use of these, we call them intention imprinted electrical devices, the continued use of this somehow conditions the space to some higher level of symmetry. And we start getting new phenomena. That is, the devices work. That is, the pH, which is normal, starts rising 1 full pH unit, if that was the imprint, or starts dropping. In the living system, you go plus or minus a half a pH unit in either direction, you're dead on both ends. So these are very big effects. So, for example, in terms of healing, one of the things that we ultimately expect to do is to be able to broadcast this so that we create an environment where people are 500 or 1,000 miles away or 10,000 miles away, wherein they can use their intention to enhance their health.
The question is, when you're studying the mind-matter interface, how do you go about studying it? From a naive point of view, you would think that maybe we should just get like a feather and see if we can make it float, or get an object and push it, something like that. The thing is, though, that happens so rarely. Even spontaneously, it happens extremely rarely. It basically never happens in the laboratory. So I think the reason that the mind-matter interface does not work very well on a large physical object is because that object has an enormous amount of inertia to stay where it is. You might be thinking thoughts at it saying, push, move, and it's thinking thoughts back at you saying, no, I don't want to. Or it would take an enormous amount of physical force in order to make it move. So back in the 1600s, when Francis Bacon was developing empiricism in science, he actually wrote in one of his books about ways of studying the mind-matter interaction and mentioned dice as a possibility. Because every time a die bounces, you can trace all the way down to quantum events which cause it to turn this way versus that way. So if it bounces a bunch of times, it basically becomes a quantum mechanical uncertainty, even in something as large as the die. So back in the 1930s, researchers started using dice as a form to see if mind can somehow get into the quantum uncertainty and bias what is happening in the die as it was rolling. Around the 1960s, when electronics came around, someone had the idea of simulating a die in electronic circuits. And the reason that that became useful was because it became very easy to measure precisely what was happening in every single bounce or equivalent of a bounce. And you could record it automatically. You can create new kinds of experiments where you didn't have to worry anymore about whether the recording was correct or whether the die became unbalanced. So random number generators, modern versions of it, were created as a refinement of techniques that had been used in the laboratory for many, many years.
And could you go over some of your findings on that?
One type of random number generator experiment that's been conducted many, many times, hundreds of times, over the past 4 decades or so, since around the 1960s, has been a random generator that only produces sequences of random bits, zeros and ones, like flipping coins. And you would simply ask somebody to press a button, it would produce 200 bits. And you would ask them to say, well, try to make it produce more 1 bits than 0 bits. And when you take the entire body of literature, all of the hundreds of experiments that have been done, you can ask a single question. Did it matter that people were trying to push it towards ones or push it towards zeros? And the overall answer is yes, it does matter, that somehow intention is correlated with the operation, with the output of these random number generators, such that if you wish for more ones, somehow the generators produce more ones. The last analysis that I did, which looked at all of these experiments, the final analysis is 50,000 to 1. The odds against chance are 50,000 to 1 that the behavior of the random number generators would go in the direction that they did, that were consistent with what intention was wishing them to do.
So when they talk about in quantum physics being a completely arbitrary and random process, what they're not accounting for is the extraordinary effect of human thought, of human intention.
When the O.J. Simpson trial was going on, lots of people are watching television because of the courtroom drama that was unfolding. And Radin intuited that there must be a lot of intention going on.
I'll preface it with why we thought of doing that in the first place. So for 30 years, people in the laboratory have been taking the random number generator and the human and asking the human to try to interact with the generator, and we see small effects. And then after a while, after repeating it over and over again, basically it gets boring. Well, what else does it mean? One of the implications of what it means is that when we deal with stuff in the laboratory, it's an artificial and constrained environment. It's extremely difficult to produce real intention and real motivation in the laboratory. But that's where these big things happen. So we're looking for ways of getting out of the laboratory, but still maintaining control over what we're measuring. So you take a random number generator into an environment like a group that's meditating. Long-term meditators, they know what they're doing, they become extremely coherent as a group. And I'm thinking, well, that would be a good place to take a random number generator, because maybe their intention is infiltrating out into the environment and creating a form of order, mind order, that would be reflected in matter. Well, so we'll take our form of matter, which is a random number generator. We know how to look for order in these things, because the only thing that can happen in a random number generator that's unusual is to become less random. So we use statistical ways of detecting that. And sure enough, my colleagues, Roger Nelson, Dick Bierman, many others around the world have taken random number generators within groups that are doing coherent things, and sure enough, the random number generators become coherent. So the matter becomes ordered. And then they started thinking, well, what would happen if we're not dealing with groups of a couple dozen, but with hundreds of millions of people, all of whom had their attention focused suddenly on something. And as it turned out, that about a month from the time I had that thought was going to be the reading of the O.J. Simpson verdict. So this was an unusual point in human history, I think, in that people knew far in advance that within a fraction of a second, either saying the words guilty or not guilty, something of very high interest would occur, which would attract hundreds of millions of people live. So I figured, okay, we have to do this as an experiment then. I had 3 random number generators running in my lab, and I asked a colleague to run a generator in Amsterdam and another in Princeton. We have 5 random number generators going. I figured it's kind of a worldwide effect. Maybe we would see a change in the generators as we approached that moment in time when the verdict was read. So we ran the generators, afterwards evaluated the results, and sure enough, we saw a spike with odds of 1,000 to 1 actually 2 places. One was when the camera switched from outside the courthouse to inside the chambers. There was like a huge rise of attention, which was reflected in the random generators. And then at the moment that the verdict was read, there was this large spike of coherence in all 5 generators at once. So this was taking an idea that we had seen in the laboratory and scaling it up to the world at large, and it appeared to work.
This leads naturally to wonder, are people affecting the world of reality that they see? You betcha they are. Every single one of us affects the reality that we see, even if we try to hide from that and play victim. We all are doing it.
Just tell me where you are. Okay, good. But hurry, will you please, because these models are giving me a headache.
10 minutes.
In the molecular structure of water and what affects it. Now, water is the most receptive of the 4 elements. Mr. Emoto thought perhaps it would respond to non-physical events. So he set up a series of studies, applied mental stimuli, and photographed it with a microscope.
For one sample of water, we drop about 0.5 cc's onto each 50 petri dishes. Then we take those 50 petri dishes and freeze them in a freezer at minus 25 degrees Celsius for about 3 hours. We take those frozen samples into a refrigerator that is set at minus 5 degrees Celsius, where a microscope with a camera is set up. There we take photographs of each of the 50 water drops individually. We first take photographs of water that we did not put any information in. Then we take the water with information and do the same procedure just described. We take those before and after photographs and compare the differences. When we projected the feeling of love and thanks to water, it made the most beautiful crystal. At times like this, I think water is at peace.
This first picture is a picture of water from the Fujiwara Dam. And this picture is the same water after receiving a blessing from a Zen Buddhist monk. Now, in this next series of pictures, Mr. Emoto printed out words taped them to bottles of distilled water, and left them out overnight. This first photograph is a picture of the pure distilled water, just the essence of itself. These subsequent photographs, as you can see, are each different. This is the chi of love. And we move along here to thank you. And you can see where he taped that to this bottle here. But if you read Japanese, you already knew that. Now, Mr. Emoto speaks of the thought or intent being the driving force in all of this. The science of how that actually affects the molecules is unknown, except to the water molecules, of course. And it's really fascinating when you keep in mind that 90% of our bodies are water.
Makes you wonder, doesn't it? If thoughts can do that to water, imagine what our thoughts can do to us.
Recently, there was the huge tsunami that happened in the ocean, and you wrote that the prayer for that. That was great. Thank you. I've noticed that when something like that happens, it seems like people from around the world, suddenly there's this outpouring of support and help. There's something about helping on the world level that seems to uplift everyone. What do you make of that?
やはりその過去もう10年ぐらいの間にいろんなところで実験を
Through my 10 years of research, I have been visually sending the message to people all over the world that people's prayers and thoughts can affect reality no matter where they are.
皆さんに届けられています。
So because this idea had already been accepted by many in the world, people probably thought, oh, so that's how it works. If we try, our energy can reach there. Then we should all pray.
祈ろうというようなことになったんではないかと思いますね。そしてまたそれが
And this is the reason why there are no great outbreaks of infectious disease as a result of the tsunami disaster of
こういうような積み重ねによってやはり人々は
With a repetition of similar actions, people may start regaining faith in prayers.
していくようになるんではないだろうか。従いまして
Therefore, in other words, there may be more disasters, be it natural or man-made, that would create more casualties along the way.
的にも襲ってくるでしょうけれども、いろいろな人たちが
Through these experiences, more people may be able to perceive these problems as their own, that they are all responsible as well.
自分のこととして考えるようになっていくんではないだろうかというふうに思います。
We really learn to love that these particular problems of separateness would just disappear, like a flimsy mist when the morning sun comes about.
So we do the O.J. Simpson thing, and we have an amazing result. A number of years go by, and more of us are getting interested in this thing. This kind of idea of taking random number generators and seeing whether we can detect the world reacting to it. So an unhappy event occurred where Princess Di died in an accident. And somewhat similar to the OJ thing, everyone knew a week in advance that there was going to be a live broadcast of the funeral. And this was such a shock around the world that we knew that it would probably attract something like 1 billion viewers live. So in this case, we had 12 colleagues, each of whom had a similar kind of random number generator around the world, and we all got together and recorded data before, during, and after the funeral, and came up with a formal test to see whether or not there was a deviation in the generators, and as it turned out, there was a significant deviation among all of these generators around the world. Another year or so goes by, and we start thinking, these one-shot experiments are interesting, but we're going to miss things that happen spontaneously. Like it would have been interesting to know what would have happened when the first news broadcast went out that Princess Di had died. So this generated the notion of the Global Consciousness Project, which was headed by Roger Nelson at Princeton. And the idea is to take random number generators, locate them around the world, run them 24 hours a day, and every 5 minutes send all the data up to a single web server at Princeton. So we have a continuous record, and we've had it now for 8 years, a continuous record of randomness from around the world. We have data now for two kinds of events, two basic types of events. We have planned events like Y2K. It was, again, a moment of a stroke of midnight where everyone was going to be paying attention in each time zone. We also have spontaneous events like 9/11 that weren't planned. But we're able to look at all of them now in terms of what happened to this randomness, this physical measure of randomness around the world when a lot of minds suddenly became focused on something. And the short story of this is we have hundreds of events now, both planned and unplanned. And it is very clear that overall, the randomness is not as random as it ought to be, by theory, when these events are occurring. Large-scale events that attract a lot of attention create a certain mental coherence, which seems to be reflected in what's going on in random generators around the world. So that's one thing of interest. The second thing of interest is, and we noticed this first when 9/11 occurred. We analyzed it very closely to see what was happening. There were 37 random generators running that day. If you go into the data and you look at it over the course of the day, 9/11, you find a very unusual statistical structure in the data. You find a 6 standard deviation change. It's as though if you think about the results of this experiment like a bell shape, we're constantly recreating a bell-shaped curve. That's what the statistics look like. And we're interested in how does the bell ring? How does it swing? How does it vibrate over time? That's the way that a way of thinking about the statistic. On 9/11, the bell rang extremely loud. It swung hard in one direction and it swung hard in the other direction, basically. And then we thought, well, that's unusual. So we compared it to other days. We started comparing it to more and more days around 9/11, and it turns out that 9/11, within the year 2001, was the loudest ringing of the bell. Well, it was probably also the most focused day of attention for 2001 and maybe since then. The other thing that was interesting is that the bell started to swing before 8:30 in the morning Eastern Time. It began to swing noticeably before the events unfolded, which suggested something like a premonition. There was something beginning to build statistically that then basically exploded at them when the events unraveled, but something was a premonition.
One of the most interesting experiments with random event generators occurred when it was really out of time. Some of the Princeton investigators and some of the other ones decided that they would try to see whether or not you could affect a random machine after it had run. So they converted it, instead of having a computer with a visual screen, they had a computerized situation that was audio tapes. And they had it with clicks in the left ear and clicks in the right ear. And they already played this with nobody listening to it, so that it already ran. They put that in a vault, and they then gave the tape, the already run tape, to a participant and said, take it home, I want you to listen to it, and I want you to make more left ear clicks than right ear clicks with it. Send your intention to it. So the person did. They handed back the tape, and they played it, and lo and behold, and they played the one in the vault too, and they discovered that they were both the same, and they both had more left clicks than right clicks. So what was going on here? Well, it wasn't as though the person who was the participant had actually affected it at the moment he was listening to it. His thoughts and his attention had moved back down the timeline and affected it at the moment it was generated.
Most people don't affect reality in a consistent, substantial way because they don't believe they can.
Cannot believe people who say that none of this is so. None of this is so is relative to them and their following. What would you rather choose? That it isn't so, or it is so? And who bags the truth? Who holds the bag of truth? Someone out there that's saying this is impossible, or somebody out there that said absolutely is? Who holds the bag of truth? We do.
I like the placebo effect because it has to do with a person's acceptance. It's really what it's about. For example, they took these group of people that had Parkinson's disease, and in Parkinson's disease there's a problem in the brain with making dopamine. There's a little nuclei called a substantia nigra that stops making dopamine. And of course, when there's no dopamine, the body starts to respond differently. We have musculoskeletal problems. We have tremors, and what's called intention tremors, or we have, foot shuffling, or we have pill rolling. And these are muscular actions that supersede our voluntary control. We can't control those. So they took a group of people that had Parkinson's disease, and they said to them, now listen, we have this injection. It's going to make you better. Well, 50% of the people that got the injection all of a sudden lost all their motor dysfunction. In other words, they weren't pill rolling, they weren't shuffling their feet anymore, they didn't have intention tremors when they were grabbing for objects. So the doctor said, well, that's a great example of a placebo, it's all in your mind. But when they checked the dopamine levels that were produced in the brain, the interesting thing that happened was that the brain started making dopamine because they accepted that they were well. In other words, their thought that they were well allowed them to begin to be well. And if you're being well in the quantum field, the observer has to supply the chemistry to match who you're being.
The issue of whether we do a detailed statement of intention, or if we do it in such a way that we leave it open for the universe to find a way to do it. Generally, it's the latter. Certainly for the water, it's the latter. For example, one of the 4 sitters, meditators, thinks of it when the intention is red and it's to increase the pH. The person visualizes a thermometer and it's going up. That's it. Okay, so each uses its own visualization. But in this particular case, then, it's just a pure intention, and the intention seems to act like a true thermodynamic potential, every bit as much as pressure and temperature, and the universe, that thermodynamic driving force, if you'll call it that, of intention, then acts on the available processes. And those processes do their thing, and the effect happens.
Well, we do create our own reality all the time, have always done so. But the type of reality that we create, with all its limitations and its suffering, disease, lack, accidents, vicissitudes of various kinds, that mirrors the consciousness that we express through. So we are creating our own reality every day, though we find that very hard to accept. There's nothing more exquisitely pleasant than to blame somebody else for the way we are. It's her fault or his fault, it's the system, it's God, it's my parents, it's the state, whatever. But in quantum physics, we're brought back to reality. Whatever way we observe the world around us is what comes back to us. And the reason why my life, for instance, is so lacking in joy and happiness and fulfillment is because my focus is lacking in those same things exactly. Now, what we're talking about here in creating our own reality is not something killy like that. We're talking about what is deeply and fully accepted in my being about life. That slowly manifests itself every day. So if I go into a grocery store and I want to manifest a $100 bill to pay for my groceries, I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about something that's much more slow to come into manifestation. But certainly the life that we experience, if we're victims, we should ask ourselves, have I a victim mentality? If I'm continually meeting misfortunes and accidents and tragedies, maybe it's because my mentality is basically attuned to accepting that this is the way life is, and so it happens. Now, why can I not achieve those things? Fundamentally through lack of focus.
The average person loses their attention span every 6 to 10 seconds per minute.
When one wants to focus intent, you want to be a singleness of mind. That's why some of the old occult teachings teach people to focus on a flame, a match flame, in fact, so that you learn to bring your attention into a very sharp channel so that the energy density becomes greater.
To create something like a $100 bill or a gold coin in my hand demands that I have to have absolute control of my thoughts and absolute acceptance that it will happen. And if we do combine those two things, and they're very difficult to achieve but not at all impossible, then they will happen. Skeptics will laugh and scoff at that, but again, time is on our side. And science, I think, is also on our side because it's showing us more and more that this is, in fact, how reality behaves. It is absolutely attendant upon a thought that is fully and deeply felt and accepted.
The mind is structured in layers, just like the universe is structured in layers, from superficial to profound. And if we use the mind at a very superficial level of ordinary thought, we have very limited power. We can barely move a speck of dust across a tabletop without using our hands. So weak can consciousness be. But at the deepest level of consciousness, consciousness creates universe. Unified field theories endow this universal unified field of consciousness with such creativity that it's constantly effervescing universes, like bubbles from effervescent ginger ale. An uncountable infinity of simultaneously emerging universes. Many of these are duds, they don't last very long, but many of them undergo cosmological inflation, exponential expansion. They spawn galaxies by the trillions.
But we always wonder then, don't we? When we wish for all of those to be able to heal with the touch and to raise the dead and to manifest a loaf of bread in our hand. And we always wonder why we can't do that, but we can never ask a question that we don't already know the answer to. And the answer is because we don't believe we could do it, and it interferes with our agenda of our own personal addictions that define us. We have never had enough time to care for anyone else other than our own emotional addictive needs.
Hey, how was the shoot? So. Your boss called. He's worried about you. Amanda, I want to thank you for letting me stay here. I know I'm a bit much sometimes and that it's been tough after Bob and all. And you've just been so wonderful. I mean, I make a mess and, well, I clean up afterwards, but it's not really your style.
Sometimes I think you make me sane.
Me? The day I make someone sane, they're in trouble. Anyway, I made you something as a thank you gift. Open it. I went through your pictures and picked my favorite ones. And it took me forever because there's so many good ones. That's for all the wonderful photos you will be taking. Oh.
I've had a strange day. Thank you.
What is my
Why
life
am I
about?
here?
Why is your life?
What is the purpose of life?
What's going on?
Where am I going? What happens when I die?
Why is there anything at all?
What is reality?
What is reality?
It makes you wonder, doesn't it? If thoughts can do that to water, imagine what our thoughts can do to us.
These are the questions. Reality ultimately comes down to our experiences. As successful answer.
What about what thoughts are made of? Is there a substance of thought?
This is a dream that I'm dreaming. Just as in a dream, you dream different characters can emerge and come out to you and talk to you and meet you and so forth. It's possible to go to another level of dreaming where you can become each of the characters that you dream.
Go backward and
What
forward.
could you be if you weren't in your body? Well, would time matter at that point, or did we just solve it? Would time go backwards? Could we go
We
backwards?
can go backward and forward in time.
Time is relative.
Goes backwards in time, and then forward in time. To
Time was not
bring
absolute.
quantum information.
Time reversal symmetry.
Of course, we can go backward and
With
forward in
random
time.
generators occurred when it was really
realities in a quantum field existing simultaneously.
The actual event of experience.
There literally are different worlds in which we live. There's the macroscopic world that we see. There's the world of our cells. There's the world of our atoms. There's the world of our nuclei. These are each totally different worlds. They have their own language. They have their own mathematics. They're not just smaller. Each is totally different, but they're complementary. Because I am my atoms, but I am also my cells. I'm also my macroscopic physiology. It's all true. They're just different levels of truth. The deepest level of truth uncovered by science and by philosophy is the fundamental truth of unity. At that deepest subnuclear level of our reality, you and I are literally one.
This gradually led into some notions that there was an invisible connection between everything. Physicists give this a name. They call it entanglement.
As Einstein put it, he didn't believe that quantum mechanics could be true because it required that there be spooky action at a distance.
That's why Einstein hated quantum mechanics. I mean, he said exactly that. If quantum mechanics is true, then there is no more science. The famous thought experiment in a paper written by Einstein, Podolsky, and Rosen in the 1930s, which drew out, it was an attempt to defeat quantum mechanics. It was an attempt to show that quantum mechanics was ludicrous. They very, very cleverly drew out one of the implications, which was not appreciated at the time, which was that if a particle, you can arrange for two particles to be created simultaneously, like a particle and its antiparticle, and you shoot them off in opposite directions, but they're in a superposition. It's two particles, but they're in a superposition, and they're in a superposition such that one state is this one up and the other down, and the other state is the reverse, this one up and this one down. And those are its two states, and it's in both of those states simultaneously, so it's a so-called two-particle state. It isn't that it has four states, it only has two states, this and this. Now something comes along and bumps the left-hand one and causes it to go into one of its two possibilities. It has two possibilities, either up or down. Let's say it goes up. Well, then it means that the other one must be down. And these particles can be 3 feet apart, or 2 miles apart, or in two different galaxies. And yet their states will be instantaneously correlated. So, in that very specific sense, the question as to whether there's a kind of feedback between quantum events and matter itself, the uncertainty is that it's tighter than a feedback loop. It's that fact is simply woven into the fabric of the entire universe, of every material bit of the universe. Anytime there's a superposition, and superpositions are happening all the time, those superpositions are correlated with untold other superpositions, and when a superposition collapses over there, it collapses simultaneously, God knows where else.
Does God know?
He's probably the only one who really does.
Spooky action at a distance. That was his term. And what he meant is that when we have our ordinary sense of the way that the fabric of reality is, it seems like these two places are absolutely in space, they're separate, and never the twain shall meet. But in fact, it's not true. At some deeper level that we can't see with our eyes very clearly, two places in space are the same. They are co-located, coexisting. So if we imagine that common sense, the way common sense literally meaning that your senses tell you about the world, if that's the way the world is actually constructed, then things like psychic and mystical experience don't make any sense at all. Because the whole point about psychic and mystical experience that makes them strange is the sense that there's some kind of connection between what's going on inside your head and things elsewhere in space and in time. So what this view of quantum mechanics provides is a way of framing what these strange experiences are like. And it reframes it from somehow magically information is getting inside my head from signals or forces or something into a different view, which is that in a sense your head, yes, is here, but it's also spread out through space and time.
What I think happens in near-death experiences, and maybe in death also, is that prior to that, while the brain's functioning, metabolism is occurring, the quantum coherence and quantum computation is being driven by the metabolism. When that ends, when the blood stops flowing, the quantum information leaks out to the universe at large because it exists in the Planck scale. It exists at the most fundamental level. Even during normal consciousness, it's occurring at the most basic level of the universe, but the Planck scale, the fundamental level, between our ears in the brain. But when the coherence is lost, it kind of leaks out to the universe at large. But it doesn't dissipate entirely because of entanglement, and plus the universe is probably holographic, so it remains with a phase relationship and can persist, at least at a subconscious dream-like state outside the body.
Spread out through space and time. And so when I'm able to get a telepathic impression from somebody at a distance, it's not because I somehow jumped out there and got it, but because at some deep level, my head and the other person's head are co-located.
We become entitled all the time when we communicate telepathically. Those experiences are so striking. I literally can read your thoughts if I become entangled with you. And such things happen. There are distant viewing experiments. There are even experiments now that you are seeing light flashes and your brain potential picks up the signature of those light flashes, what is called evoke potential, that can be measured in an EEG machine connected to your brain. And I am sitting over there, no light flashes, I cannot see you, and still my brain potentials, because I am correlated with you in terms of intention, I intend to be directly communicative with your experiences. That intention gives me the capability of simultaneously having the similar brain potential in my brain. It was first done by Jacobo Greenberg at the University of Mexico and now repeated by Peter Fenwick in London.
So let's say you wanted to, you have interested in this notion of entangled minds, entangled bodies. How would you demonstrate that in the lab? The way that we do it is we take two people and we simply ask them to keep each other in mind. We entangle their minds by asking them to do so. Just keep each other in mind. It's the mental equivalent of a physics experiment where you're entangling people. Then you wire them both up physiologically. So you might measure the heart rate on both of them, brain waves, skin conductance. You measure what's happening physiologically. Then you separate them into two places so that no ordinary form of sensory leakage can pass between them. So they can't interact then anymore by conventional means, as is done in a physics experiment. And now you do the equivalent of poke one of them and see if the other one flinches. And if it turns out that you can poke that person and that person flinches as a result, or at the right time, that's a way of demonstrating that they are still entangled even though they are no longer in the same place. What we're looking at is the brainwave. This is the raw brainwave electroencephalogram. This is skin conductance level, and this is respiration. There we go. It's going to run all by itself now.
They had wired me up and locked me in this room, a massive multi-ton Faraday cage used by the military to isolate sensitive defense computers. The shielded room was riding on springs to further eliminate all sonic, vibrational, and electromagnetic interference. Meanwhile, Mark sat in another room watching a monitor. When my picture flashed on, he was to focus on me. Computers collected our unconscious responses to see if somehow, some way, we were entangled.
You can see when the sending occurs, there's a big arousal effect here. And this is the sending side, and this is the receiving side. So what we're looking for is on this side, a response. It's possible that that is a response. I'm pulling the data from these computers into this one, where I'll be able to do the analysis. We ran a session with a sender and receiver. The sender is the red line, the receiver is the blue line. Beginning of the stimulus is here at 100, and the end is at 200. So what we're looking at is 10 seconds before the stimulus itself, and then 10 seconds after the stimulus in each case. So here we're finding the skin conductance relaxing and then meandering. The stimulus occurs and there's a big reaction in the sender, which is what we would expect. And what interestingly, here's the receiver relaxing, the stimulus occurs and suddenly starts relaxing a lot quicker and gets to the end of the period and stops relaxing. So this is somewhat unusual in that you wouldn't expect skin conductance to suddenly drop. But actually, I did an analysis to see whether this is a meaningful drop, and it turns out that it is. Significantly faster drop than you would expect by chance. So that's kind of unusual. So on average, I would say that looking at this one session with two people, it looks like the receiver is responding to what the sender was trying to do, to mentally connect. In a large-scale experiment, we would do many sessions like this. We might be doing 30 or 40 sessions like this and then combine all of the data together to see whether we're dealing with something which is true on average. But that's the result of this experiment.
A colleague of mine, Alex Wendt, is a sociology professor at Ohio State University, and he's writing a book on the premise that quantum consciousness exists and there's subconscious quantum entanglement between people. And if that's the case, then it also exists among groups of people, societies, governments, politics, and so forth. And the implications of that for this subconscious quantum entanglement interactions among people and groups of people has profound implications on the way the world runs, on the way society and governments and politics go on.
If we claim, for example, based on research, that group meditation lowers crime, prevents terrorism, even stops open warfare in war-torn areas, which is absolutely true every time, that's such important research it needs to be done again and again, published again and again, presented again and again. So I'm a little bit more involved now with the application of the knowledge of unity, how that applies to life, how it can be accessed through meditation and harnessed and utilized through group meditation.
At the end of Entangled Minds, I take 5 or 6 classes of experiments that I've created or that I've analyzed to come up with a single number of the odds against chance for telepathy in the conscious state, in the dream state, for entangled minds and bodies, for mind-matter interaction, for those classes of experiments, which is roughly 1,500 experiments. And the overall figure is 10 to the 104 to 1. So that's a big number. I mean, at some point, you have to say, well, the evidence from these experiments is so large against chance that chance as an explanation is simply not viable.
The difference between ignorance and enlightenment is ignorance always uses reality for a predictable outcome. So no one in our life is ever the love of our life. No one in our life is ever the angel in our life. No one in our life is ever the bad person in our life. No one. It's only how we react to predictable emotions that we are addicted to. And genius has none of them. Want to have a break?
Thank you very much. Camera reload, sound reload.